So to start the video off, I just want to briefly talk about the years leading up to college, because the choices you make in the years beforehand are going to have a significant impact on where you end up. As for me, I've always been someone who prioritized school from a young age, mainly due to external pressure from parents and peers. So it's a bit ironic that I didn't think much about where I wanted to attend college or if I knew what to major in. I think I cared about the idea of college, and I believed in the practical value of furthering my education, but I was never highly motivated enough to get into a prestigious university the same way some other students were. So typically, the last 2 years of high school are when students start to seriously begin their application process. And this is where I'm going to sound like a bit of a coper, but it's like the universe was encouraging me to keep procrastinating because I was roughly halfway through my junior year in high school when COVID happened. And generally speaking, the summer of your junior year is when you start to do things like college tours, study for standardized tests, and do financial and career planning for college. Especially in the first year of the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty around the situation, and I felt like the entire world had just entered this stasis. The message that was pushed a lot on the individual level was basically, you can't really do that much, but if you want to do your part, just stay inside and only go out when you need to. And how I interpreted that was to put everything productive on the back burner. Even though I had the most amount of free time in years, I just wasted it by playing video games and using social media. By the time I finally went back to school my senior year, I virtually had no preparation done for my college application, and I ended up rushing everything and wasn't able to put as much effort as I wanted to towards it. On paper, you could say I was an above average applicant. I had a high GPA and ACT score, but wasn't really that involved in any clubs, volunteer work, or societies, so I was relying almost entirely on my academic qualifications to carry me. And maybe if I were to apply like 5 to 10 years ago, I would have been just fine. But long story short, from out of everywhere I applied to, I only got into my safeties. And at the time, I cared so little about where I went to that I just picked one at random because all the costs were roughly equal. Out of my 4 years of college, I'll talk the most about my first because I did end up transferring my sophomore year. So, generally speaking, the remainder of my college experience felt vastly different just on the basis that I switched schools. And looking back at my freshman year, the entirety of it felt like a fever dream, just due to a lot of different factors. For one, the reality that I hadn't gotten into a good college was finally sinking in. I was still pretty young and had a rather idealistic and simple view of success at that age. My mentality was that if you managed to get into a prestigious college, you basically made it in life, and every other good thing would stem from that initial success. Another factor was that I went to college out of state, so I didn't know anybody, and it wasn't a major cultural shift or anything, but it still felt strange going to school in an unfamiliar environment. I know I don't really have the right to complain about that when international students are coming into countries like the US, where they have to learn the language, other cultural nuances, and deal with financial and work related challenges. But in my case, I had more of a choice when it came to where I wanted to study, and felt like I was foregoing the social benefits of going to college with friends in order to pursue a more rigorous academic experience. That sounds so pretentious, and it didn't even work as I mentioned because I only got into my safety schools. But the final thing that added to the surreal nature of freshman year was the fact that it was still in the early days of the COVID pandemic, and though I was fortunate enough to have in person courses, there were still lots of regulations and guidelines that students had to follow. Taking all these things into consideration, you get me at one of my most isolated and lonely times of my life, and all I can think about is how I messed up my future. The only comfort I had was taking pride in my schoolwork, but the coursework was so easy that it was more indicative of my work ethic than any intelligence. I would show up to class and do about only 1 to 2 hours of homework or study every day, and then have 5 to 6 hours of free time left, and that's only on weekdays. On the weekend, it was much worse. Despite all that, my freshman year was actually the best in terms of making friends and socializing. I had made 3 good friends. We weren't in a friend group or anything, we hung out separately, but I remember several instances where we'd actually go do stuff outside of class, even if it was just walking somewhere or having food together. But unfortunately, it didn't last for long because the following semester I moved off campus and practically lost touch with all of them within the first month of moving out. That's when I finally started my transfer process, though admittedly it was a bit of a spontaneous decision. So that semester was even less eventful because all I did was continue to study hard, work on my applications, and then head home the second I was done with classes. Thankfully, I was able to get into most of the schools I applied for, and the following year I'd moved back onto campus and was ready to start my sophomore year at my new college. I didn't end up transferring into some elite university, but it was a definite improvement over the school I initially attended. And even though my choices for school were mainly driven by getting into somewhere that had better academic and career resources, I was still kind of hoping that I could meet some new friends and have a social life. But within the first month at my new school, almost all hopes of that were dashed because it was still a relatively small student body, making it hard to join existing friend groups or even talk individually because it felt like everybody pretty much knew each other from freshman year. And to my credit, I did attempt to join clubs and attend on campus social events, but it was the same situation where I go and try and meet people, and everybody was already talking in these big groups. But anyway, I don't want to focus too much on the social aspect of college because I want to make a separate video on that topic. So I'm going to go back to speaking more generally about the experience of the new college. Compared to my previous school, the coursework was significantly more demanding and took up more of my time. But I wasn't bothered by that because I'd already built the habit of prioritizing homework and studying the year prior. Plus, it's not like I had anything meaningful to distract me from my work. My free time consisted of scrolling on my phone, watching YouTube, and occasionally some television. It wasn't until my junior year that I brought my PC over, so I could finally resume my video game addiction, which did make the last 2 years more bearable. That might have been the most significant difference because overall my sophomore and junior year pretty much blend together. Just to put into perspective on how boring my life was, my daily routine consisted of waking up around 9 in the morning and either heading straight to class or going to the library to study if I had some time beforehand. Almost all my classes were grouped together, and typically there was never more than an hour gap between them. So if they weren't back to back, I'd either go to my dorm, get some food, or go back to the library for more studying. Then, once all my classes were finished, I would head to the library for 2 to 3 more hours on average, then go to my dorm where I'd primarily either watch YouTube or play video games, and I'd usually head to bed around 12 most nights. And the weekends were even worse for me. I'd spend the entire day alternating between going to the library to study and then back to my dorm when I wanted a break. If I were lucky, my roommate would be gone most of the day, but if he wasn't, I would just head back to the library or go to a random building on campus until it closed, even if I was finished with my schoolwork. The one saving grace I had was that my parents got me a car halfway through my sophomore year. So for 3 semesters, if I had the free time and wanted to get out, I would just drive off to a supermarket or large retail store and either buy some cheap things or just window shop the whole time and walk around the place until I got bored and left. When I got to my senior year, I had to let my younger sibling use my car because he was still living at home and needed it more than I did. So I was stuck on campus my last year because I didn't have any friends who could drive me places. But one benefit of my senior year was that I had a dorm room to myself. I still lived with other people in a larger space, but only had to share things like the bathroom or kitchen with them, which made my routine a lot more tolerable because I knew that once I wanted to relax, I could just head back to my own room and not worry about anyone else coming into my personal space. Also, this was a constant throughout my time in college, but I never befriended any of my roommates. They would pretend I didn't exist unless they needed something from me, and I reciprocated that behavior. As I was getting through my last year and realized that my graduation was all but guaranteed, I needed to start making plans for my future. And it turns out I didn't learn anything from my past mistakes and continued to procrastinate until the final semester, where I made the decision to apply for my master's. But that is probably my most talked about topic on this channel, so I'll skip any details related to that. So graduation finally came around, and it wasn't anything special. These types of formal events are all the same to me. Truthfully, I couldn't feel too proud of myself because that moment prompted me to look back on the entirety of my college years, and it was evident that I hadn't accomplished anything outside of the classroom. I hadn't made any friends, never got into a relationship, didn't have any work experience or connections. I was essentially missing all the meaningful moments that make college enjoyable while failing to set myself up for success after graduating. And while I tried to use my academics to maintain some sense of control, it fell apart after a few months, and now I'm a NEET living at his parents' house. Now, I want to dedicate this last part of the video to talking about what I would have done differently if I could have started the whole thing over. I'm not one to normally give advice, but I did manage to get through college, so this is one of the few areas of my life where I feel somewhat qualified to talk about. And a lot of what I'll say only applies to the American college system, and if you actually want to pursue higher education, since that's what I have experience with, and this probably won't help you if you're in your junior year of college or older, because at that point you should have a good idea of whether or not you're going to have a job or just a secure plan for the foreseeable future. But the first thing I do is I'll just go to a community college for the first year or two if you know you're incapable of getting into somewhere prestigious, or if you know you're not going to thrive socially during college. Because unless the school you're going to has really good career resources and potential for networking, or you want to get into a highly specialized program, you should just save the money and earn your basic credits while using that time to research your ideal school. Another point on the practical value of school is once you've gone into a decent college, just utilize your career and networking resources the best you can, as it's the most important thing you can do during that time. It's fine if you're passionate about your major or take pride in being a good student, but it's a lot less valuable than what your school will tell you. If you manage to take easier elective courses or cheat occasionally to maintain a decent GPA, I would encourage that, but don't stress out too much about your transcript. And I know personally it's very easy to isolate when you're under a lot of stress or unsure about your future, but the best way to get a job while you're still in college is to make connections and try to socialize. This is going to sound a bit jaded, but trying to enjoy college just didn't feel realistic for me. So you might as well use that time to do the bare minimum when it comes to classwork and then spend the rest of it on career development. Sorry if I'm speaking vaguely about the steps needed to get a job. That's because I have no experience. As I mentioned, all I did was focus on classwork. There were a lot of details I glossed over as studying and attending class made up the vast majority of my time, but nobody really wants to talk about that because it's repetitive and boring. I might revisit the topic of college so I can give some anecdotes on the few times I actually left my comfort zone or some other embarrassing moments, but this video was supposed to be more of an overview of my college experience. Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about, so I'll see you guys in the next video.